Welcome to Chapter 2, The Church and the City, a Historical Perspective. We are here in Pittsburgh at First Presbyterian Church, one of the oldest churches in our city. It's founded in the mid-1700s and has a storied history, as many city churches do. As we engage in this next section, this next chapter, we're going to examine church ecclesiology, a big word exploring what we mean when we say church, and we will look at historic models of the church and how churches have related to their cities. We'll also look at the impact of the church in society, how she has helped transform and develop cities, and we'll look at the concept of charity from the perspective of the body of Christ. We'll also begin learning about systems thinking and how we can better see the systems at play as we look to further chapters on justice, culture, and people in systems that may or may not share our same traditions.
Well, good morning or afternoon or evening, wherever you are and whatever time it is. I'm glad to be with you. My name is Terry McGonigal. I've been involved in relational friendship and work with Dave Hillis, president of Leadership Foundations, and Larry Lloyd, who's coordinating the From Charity to Change Thriving Congregations grant that the Lilly Endowment is provided to leadership foundations to enable this very, very important work. I'm very familiar with Lilly. I'm currently responsible to be managing 4 different grants from Lilly, including a Thriving Congregations grant for Whitworth University Christian College in Spokane, Washington. And I look forward to this conversation with you. I've taught at the undergraduate and the graduate levels extensively, been very involved in ministry, both in the United States as well as overseas, primarily in Central America. And there's nothing that I'm more passionate about than asking the question, how can the church in the 21st century, given all of the challenges that are before us, as leaders of ministry, people in churches that have, you are embedded in your neighborhoods and you are trying to navigate. And I'm very aware of the pressures that you have been under and continue to be under during this period. So I hope that you'll find this presentation hopeful and encouraging and challenging, because as I've studied this topic in preparation for this conversation with you, one of the things that I've been struck by is how creative early Christians were at times of great challenge in their lives and in their ministries. So I think that there's a lot that we can learn, and hopefully that this can be a springboard to some creative venues as we go forward, which is the purpose of this From Charity to Change initiative. The title is The Early Church in the City. So how can we learn from that period after the death and resurrection and ascension of Jesus, as the church started to form? How can we learn from them about how they navigated in their world? And are there lessons that we can learn from today? So I want to begin with the book of Acts. In chapter 2, we know Peter delivers the Pentecost sermon under the guidance and inspiration of the Holy Spirit. And on that first Pentecost Sunday, 3,000 people enter into this journey of being followers of Jesus and entering into this journey together. So there are 3 elements that I want to mention from Acts chapter 2 to 6, I think were hallmarks of the early church. The first of those, coming from Peter's sermon, is proclamation, the verbal telling of the story of Jesus in such a way that not only are people's minds stimulated, but their hearts are challenged. And at the end of that sermon, the question that so many people raised to Peter and the other believers that were gathered there, the 120 who received the gift of the Holy Spirit, was, what shall we do to be saved? And so this word salvation takes on, raises the question of, what does salvation look like in the early church? And salvation is about wholeness. It's about the flourishing of life. Yes, it does have to do with life after death, but the gospel was lived out in such a way in the early church that people got to see salvation, wholeness, flourishing day in and day out by how Christians live. So the first element is proclamation. The second one is community. So at the end of Acts chapter 2, and again at the end of Acts chapter 4, we find that the community comes together. Now keep in mind who these people are. At the beginning of Acts 2, we have the list of all the people groups that are gathered there on Pentecost morning in front of the temple. And as we review all of those people groups in Acts chapter 2, what we discover is that Luke has intentionally named most of the people groups in the entire Roman Empire. In other words, in Jerusalem on this particular day, Luke is saying the whole world is gathered. And here they are. And we're going to see how that idea of the whole world expands as we get further into the book of Acts. And so they form community. They start to share meals together. They pray together. They study the scriptures together. Proclamation, community, and the third one is service. Now, if we go to Acts chapter 6, there is a daily distribution of food being given, and there are people who are being left out of the distribution of food. And so the question that arises is, what's going on here? Why is there this sense of injustice? So think about that. There's a need for eating, but some people, specifically Jewish widows, are being cared for more specifically than Gentile widows. Now, they are all part of this early Christian community. But one group of people is having their whole need met while another one isn't being met. So there's a need. The need is simple and basic. People need food. There's also injustice. And while the word justice does not appear in the narrative, it certainly is the core issue of this story. Jews are getting food and Gentiles aren't. Jewish women are getting food, Gentile women don't. So in the midst of this, how is the early church going to respond to what is clearly a narrative of injustice and sexism and ethnic prejudice? Well, the church responds and they raise up leadership. This is so important for this whole conversation that we're going to be about. They raise up leadership. 7 people are chosen, all with Greek names. Multicultural leadership is called out of the community in order to meet the need that is before them in Acts chapter 6. And this is a great illustration of what service looks like. So think of what happens after Acts chapter 6. Then in Acts chapter 8, the gospel goes forth through Philip into Samaria and then to the Ethiopian eunuch. In Acts chapter 10, Peter is called to the home of Cornelius, a Roman centurion of the Italian cohort, very important element of that narrative. These would be considered some of the elite troops in the entire Roman military army. And the Christian community grows. Now, as the Christian community spreads, there certainly are skeptics within the Roman Empire. And they recognize these pillars of the early community. In the writings of Roman historians, they talk about these are people of the book, that would be the scriptures. They read the scriptures, they listen to them intently. They are people who listen to the proclamation of stories about Jesus, and they are people who are tenaciously committed to living out this way of life. And the Roman historians write, particularly to the emperor, look at how these people live. The key word is look. It was in how these early Christians lived that their commitment to Jesus was demonstrated. And it was in how they lived out the Christian community that the lived out Christian community that there was growth in the community. Their beliefs were on display in the quality of their life. And that's the hallmark of the early church. Look at how they live, and we will know how they believe, and we will understand the values of this community. So what kind of a community was this? Well, the Romans identified actually three groups. The Romans called themselves the first way, and of course they did. They were in control of the world at that point. And the Romans were used to cultural privilege, but religiously they were committed to syncretism. Just add on one particular god to another and keep expanding the whole array of gods that you worship, including eventually the Roman emperor. So the first way was Roman cultural privilege marked by religious syncretism. The second way that the Romans identified a group of people is what they called the Jewish way, and they recognized that Jewish people were monotheists. They would not participate in religious syncretism of worshiping a variety of gods. And they also recognized that because of this commitment to monotheism, Jewish people were committed to an approach to interacting with Rome that was basically isolation. Stay away from those evil, wicked, pagan people. But then this third way emerges, and this is the title that the Romans used for this new group of people, Christians. They see the Christian way as permeating the life of the city with a lifestyle that emulates Jesus. Now, if you looked in any city, you couldn't tell Christians apart by how they dressed, or what language they spoke, or what kind of food they ate. Those were the particularities of each city. But they could tell who the followers of Jesus were by how they loved other people. This third way is about the constant adaptation of the particular needs of each city. Innovation in order to share the love of Jesus with everyone, because each person is created in God's image. So the images of innovation, or if you're a jazz artist, you know about improvisation, improv, constantly responding to what's in front of you in order to move forward. So let's talk about these cities where the early Christians were embedded. Rodney Starks identifies in his book, Cities of God, that there were 31 cities in the Roman Empire around the Mediterranean Sea of over 30,000 people. Now, that might not sound like much today, but those were the gathering points that were the hubs that allowed the entire Roman Empire to function. Now, we know the names of many of these cities because they're identified for us in the book of Acts and in Paul's letters. Ray Bakke, in his presentation that you looked at in the previous module, talked about Thessalonica being the smallest of all the cities that Paul wrote to. Thessalonica probably, according to Rodney Stark in his book, Cities of God, had a population of about 35,000 people. The Roman Empire, in contrast, had about 500,000 people. Now, those numbers are very, very flexible because what we're building upon are the archaeological records of the Roman Empire, and they were counting the people that actually meant something in terms of Roman cultural values. Are they part of those who are participating in making the empire run? What we also know is that underneath that count are literally hundreds of thousands, millions of people who were slaves. Now, 2/3 of all urban dwellers in the empire lived in or near these 31 cities. 2/3 of all urban dwellers in the Roman Empire lived in or near these 31 cities. These cities are the key to understanding what was going on in the entire empire. Wayne Meeks, in his book, The First Urban Christian, says the cities were where the power was, and the cities were the place where changes could occur. Now, the Roman Empire was built on trade, and cities were strategic because of the constant flow of people. The Mediterranean world was a connected network of seaports, and it's the seaports that are key to understanding the multicultural nature of the empire, and it's these seaports that are absolutely essential for understanding how the early Christians spread out over the empire and lived out the life of Jesus in these cities. So think of the region. We have North Africa, and then we swing over to the area of Israel, Palestine. Then we go north to Antioch. Archaeologically, Antioch had 18 distinct ethnic groups identified archaeologically. We'll come back to Antioch a little bit later. Then there's Asia Minor. You know a lot of the cities in Asia Minor: Ephesus, Corinth, Philippi, Athens, Thessalonica, and then on to Rome. And then beyond these regions were the trade routes that were taking goods and people and services east into Persia and India, and south into Africa. It's one of those people that Philip encounters in Acts chapter 8 with the Ethiopian eunuch on his way back to Ethiopia from traveling to Jerusalem. Now, the port cities were the places where all kinds of people crossed paths, where trade markets developed, where various ethnic groups established their own communities to support this trade. Historians estimate that about 5% of the entire population of the empire were elite. They were wealthy. They were Roman citizens either by birth or by purchasing citizenship. And it was this 5% of the people that controlled the levers of imperial power. And underneath that were 95% of the underclass. Now, the wealthy lived in large, expansive estates. And keep in mind that in the Mediterranean world, climate is very temperate to exceedingly hot. The elite built homes in order to keep themselves comfortable. The underclass, the impoverished, the 95%, in contrast, were tightly compacted into multi-story apartment buildings, very cramped, and the less money you had, the higher you lived in these buildings, because in most of these apartments there were no windows. So it was hotter and hotter in each successive story as you went up into these buildings. That's where all the people who served the empire lived, pressed together. Now, the conditions for the 95% were absolutely terrible. As an illustration, most people dealt with matters of sewage by taking the chamber pots that they had in their apartments and poured them out into the streets. And so the streets were also sewers. Nobody wanted to be on the streets. You can imagine the smell, the stench, and the danger of disease spreading in these kinds of conditions. So where did people go? They went to the outdoor marketplace, the place where all the commerce and all the trade, food could be purchased there, and goods and services could be moved back and forth. And it was in the outdoor marketplace where various cultures came together. This is where Paul and his companions set up shop as tent makers And everywhere that Paul goes, he ends up in the marketplace because he knew that's where the people were. Right where all these people gathered, right where all these different cultures interact with each other. It's in the marketplace that Christians live out this third way. So what does this third way look like? Well, when we listen to the writings of early church leaders, we find that they emphasize two particular scriptures, one from the Old Testament and one from the New Testament, in particular to guide them in the living out of this third way, the way of Jesus in the midst of all of this cultural exchange. The first of those comes from Exodus chapter 20 all the way to the end of Deuteronomy chapter 28. And in that extended section, second part of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, 28 times we find the injunction, now think about these people now, care for the orphan, the widows, and the Hebrew word is gerim, G-E-R-I-M. Those are the non-Hebrew people living among you. We would paraphrase it today as sojourners, travelers, caravaneers. The disparaging term that sometimes is used is aliens, but the problem with the term alien is that it creates a cast or a view that some people are subhuman, and that is exactly what Christians resisted completely. But care for these groups of people, the orphan, the widows, and the gerim, 92 times the gerim, the other, the sojourner is mentioned in the Old Testament, and 46 times in the book of Deuteronomy, Moses tells the people, care for the gerim who are among you, because you were the gerim in Egypt. In other words, what Pharaoh tried to do to you, he viewed you as the other, as the alien, as the threat, as not worthy of life. And that's why the Exodus had to take place, for God to intervene and save you out of that horrific oppression. Those were the texts in the Old Testament. In the New Testament, it's Matthew 25. No surprise here. Jesus says, when you're thirsty, give me something to drink. When you are a stranger, in other words, when you are the other, welcome me. When you are naked, clothe me. When you are sick, visit me. When you are imprisoned, come to me. Jesus is identifying people in desperate need, and he's telling his exhorters, and he's telling his followers, take care of them, for if you take care of them, you are caring for me. Jesus is making himself one with all those in need. Well, the early church took up these biblical mandates. They took them to heart, and that is exactly how they lived. Always improvising, always innovating, depending upon the specific needs at any particular point in time in each city. Christians were called then, as we are called now, to the margins, among the least powerful, to care for them because they are God's children. They are created in God's image, Genesis 1:26 and 27. So let me give you 5 different arenas where the third way lived out this faithful gospel calling. First of all, business. I've already mentioned this. In Acts chapter 16, who does Paul encounter in Philippi? Lydia. And she's from the city of Thyatira. She's traveling with her purple cloth, which would be a sign of being elite. In other words, she catered to the elite by virtue of her trade. And there she is in Philippi, and she encounters Paul, and it's clear that Lydia is a person of some means because she insists that Paul and his companions come and stay in her home. In other words, she had a place that was large enough to handle visitors and take care of them as guests. Acts chapter 19, Paul's in Ephesus for 2 years. And where is he? He's in the marketplace. And as he is carrying out his tent making practice, he's also sharing the gospel with the inhabitants of Ephesus, which causes a large cultural conflict that leads to the near riot that's described in Acts chapter 19. Well, what I find interesting is that the town clerk steps forward with Paul and his Christian friends. Their lives are in jeopardy. We would call him today the mayor. The mayor steps forth and says, hey, these people that you are accusing of being enemies of Ephesus, they're not sacrilegious, they're not blasphemers, and they are not enemies of the city of Ephesus. I know these people. I know their reputation, and I'm speaking for them. Now stop the threat to them. If you've got anything to accuse them of, let's bring it to court, but don't you dare accuse them of being enemies of the city of Ephesus. Paul had so embedded these Christian values in Ephesus that the mayor stands up and defends him. And the pattern continues. In the first 3 or 4 centuries, the people who were involved in trade, in business, are called upon to serve the community and to support the common good through the ministry that's flowing into each city by the church. Over time, more and more Roman elites actually become members of the Christian community. And the early Christian leaders deliver a clarion call to these Roman elites to repent of their greed and materialism, to avoid luxury, to steward their resources to assist those in need. And we'll see how important that becomes later on. And do all this because you yourselves have experienced the Christian community. Innovation creates motivation. You've accumulated your wealth. Have you done that to serve yourself or to serve others? So, 2 illustrations. One here in Pasadena, California, where I've just moved in the last few months. Corey Marquez. Corey's a business development consultant specializing in commercial real estate. He's helping churches think about their properties as a potential ongoing revenue stream of renewing revenue. He's helped churches negotiate with Trader Joe's for Trader Joe's to not purchase, but to lease some of the land that churches are sitting on with their parking lots to put up a Trader Joe's store in exchange for some of the profits of that particular store. And ministries have sprung up out of that. Well, Corey and some friends saw an opportunity to purchase a CrossFit gym here in Pasadena. And that business was purchased. They don't own the building. They own the business renting the building. But on Sundays, they break down the gym, and that's where Corey's church, New Abbey Church, worships. And I've worshiped there. It is a vibrant, thriving, multi-ethnic community that is being supported by the renewal of funding through business. Or I think of Spokane, Washington, where a building, abandoned building right across the street from First Presbyterian Church. It was bought by First Presbyterian Church. They then went into partnership with World Relief, the local relief agency that settles refugees in Spokane. And 12 refugee families have come together to form a restaurant there. I love the name of this, Feast World Kitchen. Some of the partners come from Asia. Others come from Sudan. Some are from Syria. Some are from Afghanistan. And together they have formed this business. They just had their first street fair last month, and over 500 people. They shut down the street between the restaurant and the church on a Sunday afternoon. 500 people came out and celebrated this new business. So business is a way in which early Christians thought about how to live out the third way and use it for the sake of ministry in the city. A second one, and Ray mentioned this in his presentation last month, what he called baby hunts. There was a common practice in the Roman Empire to abandon newborn children, especially girls, simply because the culture accepted that practice. So if parents did not want that child, you took the child to the outskirts of your city and town, dropped the child off, you left the child there, and the child died. Christians said no. This cultural practice is contrary to the witness of Scripture. Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 and 27 says, every person is created in God's image. Can't throw away babies like unwanted trash. So Christians started to send out groups to the edge of town, as Ray described, to the fringe areas on the outskirts of the cities. They would find these abandoned babies. They would bring them back safely. They would provide havens of shelter for them and care for them. But think about this now. This is no short-term project. This is a long-term investment. These abandoned orphans have no parents, no means of support, no home, no food, no clothes, yet Christians did this. And of course, out of this initial commitment comes the first orphanages that the world had ever had. And the Roman Empire recognized that there was something unique and different about the way Christians were caring for these abandoned babies and creating literally a new institution. And of course, right behind then the establishment of orphanages comes the need for education. Education is not just for the elite, but it included every child. And so these orphanages, over time, children were cared for and educated. The commitment to abandon babies led to the first orphanages, which led to educating the children, which led to an emphasis on education and the development of schools. Now, our previous president at Whitworth University, Beck Taylor, did extensive research as part of his commitment to study the social impact of economics. And what he discovered was that those societies that invested well in their children were the societies that had all of the highest marks in terms of thriving life. If we invest in our children at the beginning, that pays a benefit to all people in the society for multiple generations. That's what the Christians were doing in the early church, investing in the children who then grew up into adolescents and adults and leaders. And over a long period of time, there were drastic cultural changes because these children had been loved and cared for because they were created in God's image. Well, a third area where churches engaged the culture was in politics. Now, in the book of Acts, there are 41 different people mentioned who are government officials. It's clear that early Christians interacted with and they knew the city leaders. That's obvious from the story I just told from Acts chapter 19, where Paul is known and seems to be on very good terms with the mayor. Remember what Wayne Meeks said. The cities were where the power was and where changes could occur. Now let me give you an illustration of what this looks like from the Gospels. In John's Gospel, in chapter 5 and verse 18, the Sanhedrin, the ruling Jewish council, decides that Jesus must be murdered. So in the first quarter of John's Gospel, the shadow of the crucifixion already casts itself long and large over John's Gospel. And yet, in chapters 6 to 10, Jesus engages in 4 different dialogues with the Sanhedrin. They're heated, They're confrontational, but Jesus is engaged with them. And I've often asked myself the question, why would Jesus engage with people who have already decided to murder him? Well, John doesn't give us a theological answer for that question. He doesn't write a political treatise. He gives us an answer in the form of relationships. At Jesus' burial, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus who shows up in John chapters 3 and chapter 6, they're the ones who take responsibility for the body of Jesus and they bury him. In doing so, they cut off all ties with the Sanhedrin. Sanhedrin would have nothing to do with them from that point on. I think Jesus stayed engaged with that group of people in order to touch the hearts of some of those members of the Sanhedrin and help them understand God's great love incarnate in Jesus. Now we find the same thing with Paul in Philippi. Paul intervenes with the Roman jailer and saves his life, then shares the gospel. We find Cornelius, the Roman centurion, appealing for Peter to come and share the gospel. The writings of early Christian leaders are constantly engaging government leaders. They knew them and they tried to influence them. Now, there was no political partisanship in the scriptures or in the early church. There was no political partisanship, but there certainly was engagement. And so we are called as Christians to political engagement as a witness to the gospel of Jesus. And I know for those of you who are leaders that it's difficult to navigate when everything and everyone seems to be polarized. So one of the questions you may want to explore in your processing as you go through this from Charity to Change cohort is, how do we live as third wave followers of Jesus today, given the political polarization in our country? So we've talked about business, we've talked about children, we've talked about politics. Here comes a fourth one, healthcare. Healthcare was one of the hallmarks of the early Christian church. Now, here's what we know, both from the writings of early Christians as well as from Roman history, is that the Roman Empire had several terrible plagues that struck the empire. One of those happened in AD 160. Another one happened over a 20-year period from 250 to 270 AD, and it spread all through the Roman Empire. And these trade routes that were so important became ways in which the plague spread. Cyprian was the bishop in North Africa, and he writes extensively in his sermons and writings about these groups of people that rose up to care for those who were suffering from the plague, to create places where they could be gathered and cared for. Cyprian actually organized a group of 500 followers of Jesus to become grave diggers, because like with sewage, the bodies of the dead were simply dropped out, left out in the streets. But Cyprian said to his people, every human is created in God's image, and every person is worthy of a Christian burial. So 500 grave diggers were part of the Christian community in Carthage, a similar number in Alexandria in North Egypt. So listen to just a couple of descriptions about these communities. This is from the book Medicine and Healthcare in Early Christianity. The Great Plague of the mid-3rd century, that would be the plague of 250 to 270, provided the church with its greatest opportunity for broad extension of medical charity. Beforehand, the tendency had been to focus medical care for the sick inwardly. Increasingly, Christian medical care became outwardly focused, now enlarged to include many who were victims of the plague. The structures were already there because of the way the church had organized itself. And the benevolence was already there because Christians were known as the lovers of the poor. Christians, influenced by many biblical texts that we've already spoken about, wrote about the care of the poor as a duty. They saw these poor people who were struck down by the plague as especially blessed by God, endued with special grace, and still bearing the image of God. They regarded giving to them as giving to Christ, and philanthropy to the poor as demonstrating their love for the Savior. There it is, the living out of Matthew 25 on the streets of Carthage during the plague. Gregory of Nazianzus writes that a new form of community emerged, and this new form of community was led by Basil in Caesarea, and the formation of this new community actually led to the development of a new city. Here's what Gregory of Nazianzus says: "Go forth a little way from the city of Caesarea, and behold, you will find a new city, the storehouse of piety, where disease is regarded in a religious light, disaster is thought as a blessing, and sympathy is put to the test. You will find a new kind of city where sympathy is put to the test." And the outgrowth of this particular care for the poor struck down by this plague was the actual growth of a city called Basileia, in honor of Basil, not far from Caesarea. A new city emerged that was permeated by Christian values. Well, several years ago, I traveled to Nairobi, Kenya, to think about the biblical theme of shalom with leaders from Young Life from all over the world. And one of the people that I met there was a gentleman named James Davis. James was the country leader for Young Life in Liberia. And James told me the story of what happened when Liberia was struck by Ebola. Immediately, the government called for a complete shutdown of all schools, public gatherings. Young Life could not function in terms of gathering adolescents together anymore. And so James and his friends got together and prayed, much like we see prayer meetings in the book of Acts, asking God to lead. And out of that prayer came the commission that 3 of them would go out and care for the families that were struck by Ebola of the adolescents that they knew through the Young Life ministry. James and several others wore PPP or PPE, the gear to keep you safe. Other people gathered up food, boiled water, and for a whole year, James and his team visited these homes. Now, when Ebola was over and they looked back on what had happened, what they discovered was not one person who was struck with Ebola, who was visited by James, died. And you can imagine, as the reopening took place, the opening that was there for people to hear more about the gospel of Jesus because of the way that James and these faithful Christians had cared for people during the pandemic. Now, that's a remarkable story. And out of that came camps for kids whose families had survived Ebola because they were suffering from post-traumatic syndrome. How is it that we today, in the midst of the COVID crisis, can express this same kind of love for other people where sympathy is put to the test as a witness to our commitment to Christ. The last and final one is immigrants and refugees. The Roman Empire was known for creating mobility, and there was all kinds of people moving around the Roman Empire. In Acts chapter 18, we're told that Paul is in Corinth, and he meets Aquila and Priscilla, who are identified ethnically as Jews, but that they had recently had to leave Italy because Claudius, the emperor, had issued a recommendation in which all Jews had to leave Rome. It's called the Edict of Claudius, and it stood for 10 years. Those who were associated with Judaism, including followers of Jesus, because Jesus was a Jew, were evicted from Rome for a decade. And then in 58, the edict is over and people start to come back. If you read the book of Romans, you find that Paul ends the book with listing 39 people who are known. Out of those 39, 9 of them are women. The first of the 9 is Phoebe, a deaconess. Priscilla and Aquila from Acts chapter 18 are also mentioned there in Romans chapter 16 and verse 3. They're described as people who risked their lives to save my life, Paul says, to whom not only I, but all the churches of the Gentiles give thanks. So here were these Jewish followers of Jesus that were willing to risk their lives to care for Gentile followers of Jesus. We also find in Romans chapter 16, this statement, verse 13, greet Rufus, one who is called by Christ, and his mother as well, who is like a mother to me. Rufus, this is the same Rufus who's mentioned by Mark in chapter 15 and verse 21, the Rufus whose father Simon helped the cross to Calvary. Rufus has now become a leader in the church in Rome, along with his own mother. So the Acts chapter 18 in the book of Romans provides some powerful illustrations for us. In Acts chapter 13, we find this text about the commissioning of Paul. In the church at Antioch, there were prophets and teachers, Barnabas, Simeon, who's called Niger. In other words, Simeon came from Nigeria. Lucius of Cyrene, Manaen, a member of the court of Herod the Tetrarch. This is the Herod who killed John's brother James in the previous chapter, Acts chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. It's clear that Manaen has left the service of Herod. He's joined the Christian community. All of them are gathered together and they lay hands on Paul and Barnabas and send them off. A Nigerian and a Cyrenian were important members of the community, which called Paul and Barnabas to their ministry. They laid hands on them, prayed for them, and sent them out. So think of what is happening throughout this period. There's the dispersion of Jewish believers in Acts chapter 8. And then in chapter 7, in AD 70, the Romans destroyed Jerusalem, and there's this dispersion of Jews who were inhabiting Jerusalem and Judea, and they are spread out all over the Roman Empire as a result of political turmoil, military violence, and the threat of starvation because food supplies were cut off. Does that sound familiar? It's the nature of our world today. The largest mass movement of peoples in the history of the world. We face that today, and the early church faced it in the first 300 years. So let me just give you an illustration of how I see churches leaning into this. I'm going to go back to Spokane, the community that I lived in for 27 years, did extensive work with World Relief. World Relief 2 years ago celebrated bringing the 10,000th family group to Spokane. The first migration were Russians and Ukrainians after the Soviet Union dissolved in the early 1990s. And out of that first wave of migration, those Russians and Ukrainians have formed 13 churches spread out all over Spokane. They hold posts in local government and construction and immigration services. Since 9/11, vast numbers of Middle East Muslim populations have come to Spokane. More recently, the Rohingya from Asia, who are going through the horrific persecution in Myanmar. And now there are about 100 Afghan families living in Spokane. And the word that's come from the government is that to expect 300 more families coming in the next few months. They will be initially hosted by these Afghan families that are already there, but there is a huge need in Spokane, as there's going to be all over our country, to welcome the thousands of people who have fled the tragedy of what took place in Afghanistan over the last several months, years, and decades. I'm speaking to you on September 15th, 2021, just a few weeks after the collapse of the Afghan government and the airlift of 120,000 people out of the Kabul airport. Well, World Relief in Spokane is partnering with 8 Christians. These are people who are entrepreneurs and construction companies, and they bought an 8-unit apartment complex. The property has room for the construction of another 8 units. And so they are quickly renovating the existing complex as well as building the new complex in order to get ready for this initial influx of families. Well, at the same time, churches around Spokane are challenging the zoning codes in the city and in the county regarding parking spaces and trying to repurpose their land for housing for refugees by buying and putting on their lots tiny houses where families can live as a bridge to a final settled place as they begin to grow into the Spokane region and become participants in education, business, commerce, and everything else that's going on there. In conclusion, let me just give you a brief little summary. This kind of third way living from the early church created improbable growth. Rodney Stark, in his book, and Cities of God, estimates that if there were about 1,000 Christians in the year 40, and he knows that's a low number because obviously 3,000 came to faith at Pentecost, but if you take the number 1,000 and multiply that by 3.4% growth per decade, every decade the church is growing by 3.4%. You multiply that out, and by the year 300, there were over 50 million believers in the early church. How did that happen? Well, here's the last hallmark of the early church. It's patience, what one author calls the ferment of the church. There was not one treatise that can be found in any of the early church writings in this first several centuries on evangelism, not one. But there were 3 treatises about patience. Cyprian, the bishop of Carthage in North Africa, in 256, in the middle of the plague that swept across the region from 250 to 270, writes this: "We are philosophers, not in words, but in deeds. We exhibit our wisdom not by dress, but by truth. We know virtues by their practice. Rather than boasting of them, we do not speak great things, but we live them." And Tertullian, also in North Africa, writing around the year 200, wrote this: "Patience is the highest virtue of all Christian spiritual values." Tertullian says there must be no discrepancy between our words and our deeds. And then this conclusion: patience is preeminent for the Christian community because it is rooted in the character of God. As we see God allowing himself to become incarnate, a self-positioning of patience in the midst of our broken world. So, sisters and brothers in Christ, as we live out this third way with innovation, with improvisation, and with patience, may these hallmarks of the early church provide us hope and encouragement and courage and challenge as we think of the incredible opportunity that we have today to live out the gospel in the 21st century. May the peace of Christ be upon each of you. God bless you. Amen.
Welcome to our Charity to Change program. Eager to have you hear from one of my good friends, A.G. Miller. We're looking forward to this time together. Let me introduce Dr. Albert G. Miller, affectionately referred to as A.G. We go way back. He's originally from New York and presently just retired as Professor of Religion and African Studies at Oberlin College, where he was a professor for a number of years and currently a pastor. And he's the pastor of the Oberlin House of the Lord Fellowship there in Oberlin, Ohio. So he's been a professor. His educational background, he's got a BS, a Bachelor in Social Work from Adelphi University, a Master's in Social Work, MSW, from that same university. But AG, that just wasn't enough for him, so he went and got a MA in religion from Princeton University, and that wasn't enough. So he got his PhD in religion from Princeton University as well. Before going to Oberlin College, he was Director of Training and Recruitment for the Young Life National Urban Office, or Young Life National Office of Urban Affairs in Denver, Colorado. So he has a rich history, not only in parachurch ministry as a pastor, church, not only in Oberlin, but elsewhere, and also as a professor of religious studies at Oberlin. So he brings a wealth of information to us. So with that, I want to welcome AG.
Wow. I'm humbled to be able to bring greetings to you. The great church tradition that I come from, that bring you greetings from the Oberlin House of the Lord Fellowship, where I serve as pastor, and we're part of a much larger body called the House of the Lord Churches, and we are so excited to be here with you, Larry, and and with all of the members or pastors or organizations that are involved in this exciting project. Just for a word of clarity, so that if my baby sister ever saw this, that she would know that I wasn't trying to ignore my roots. I was born and raised in Columbia, Missouri, but I think that when I ran into our relationship with Larry, I had just come from New York, where my wife was born, and 3 of our 4 kids were born, and in fact they're all back there now and in New York living as adults. And but it was Larry and I do go way back, and did a lot of teaching and organizing together and working together. And so this has been it's a real treat to be able to be here with you.
Well, great, AG. We're looking forward to our time together. In America, we have the white church, the black church, the evangelical church, the charismatic church, the mainline denominations. We often refer to the black church and the white church. So from your perspective, what is the black church, and how do you define the notion of the black church?
Yeah, that's a great question, because it's not simple. It's a complicated answer. You mentioned all these other church traditions that are out there, and evangelical and mainline and all of that. And they too are all a part of what we think about as the black church. So let me say it this way. The black church is really a kind of a mixture of African spirituality, with the evangelical gospel of Jesus Christ, which was shaped through the experience of the Middle Passage of enslavement, and continues to struggle for freedom and black self-determination. Now, I use that word evangelical advisedly in today's climate. And when I use it, I'm thinking of the notion of a kind of 19th century revivalism, evangelicalism, where black and white churches were being formed into denominations, and there was this great evangelical fervor of preaching the gospel and conversion of souls, and with a combination of some understanding of the social implications of what that conversion experience meant, and how churches structured themselves. And so I want to just be clear about that. The black church emerges out of the crucible of slavery, but it doesn't start there. It really comes with with the African background. Africans, before they got to the Americas, they had religion, they had spirituality, and black people, as they some even came to these shores and to the Caribbean and to Central and South America, were already Christians but enslaved. They were already Muslims but enslaved, and then others came and gradually began to go through conversion experiences into the Christian faith, but they never left totally and gave up. There's a certain deep, rich spirituality that comes from the African background that has merged and mixed with the Christian experience as to what we now call the black church. Some have argued that the black church is really limited to kind of 7 major black historic denominations. That is the National Baptist Convention USA, the National Baptist Convention of America Unincorporated, the Progressive National Baptist, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the African Methodist Zion Church, the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church, and the Church of God in Christ, the one Pentecostal body. But I would want to argue that the expressions of what we call this conglomeration called the black church includes more than just those traditional denominations that most of us or many of us recognize, and maybe some of us are even part of. But it also includes and represents congregations that are in largely predominantly white denominations, whether Episcopalian, Presbyterian, American Baptist, Southern Baptist, United Methodist, Wesleyan, Plymouth Brethren, Assemblies of God, Lutheran, and Catholic. All of those are included in what we kind of think of as the church. And then we have a host of these newer kind of independent, we call them non-denominational churches. And they have brought on a kind of whole new wave of thinking about what even that ask the question, is denominationalism even a viable term anymore? The great scholar Gaylord Wilmore, in his classic work called Black Religion and Black Radicalism, he kind of spoke about what he saw as the radical stream within the black religious experience. And he argued that there were 3 radical characteristics of this radical tradition in black religion. And he used that black religion largely to uncover and enclose not only the traditional black churches, but even Islam and Christianity and Judaism, black forms of that. And he would say that the three characteristics, and I think that these are important. One was that it was formed in a quest for independence from white control. Two, it was the revalorization of the image of Africa. And three, the acceptance of protests and agitation as the theological prerequisites for Black liberation and for the liberation of all oppressed people. And so out of this kind of broad definition, it's a continuum of understanding theologically as well as otherwise, from evangelical, conservative fundamentalists to kind of radical liberal, from heavily emphasis on spirituality and otherworldly focus to only focusing on this worldly reality with no emphasis on spirituality and other reality focus. So you find all of that and in between. So the Black church has always been the most independent institution in the African American community. That is to say that in many cases, the Black church and Black leadership couldn't be bought off. They couldn't be intimidated. They were fiercely self-determined. Some have even called, I would say this probably for each one of the denominations. If you scratch a Baptist, you find a Black nationalist. If you scratch an AME, you'll find a Black nationalist. And even a Pentecostal, if you scratch one, you'll find a Black nationalist. What do I mean by that? That you'll find that these denominations are fiercely independent and self-determining. They raise their own monies. They pay their own pastors. In whatever forms that they do that, these ministers and the congregations are fiercely loyal and committed to the mission of those churches. So, Larry, I'll stop there, but maybe that'll help you, give you some sense of what I'm thinking, how we complicate this notion of the Black church.
Yeah, well, you certainly have complicated. Congratulations. Thanks for that. I grew up in the South, and my understanding of a lot of the African American church culture, kind of started in the rural South.
Sure.
Where slavery, of course, was rampant. But eventually, of course, not in the South as well as in Philadelphia and New York, the Black church began to inhabit the city. So this notion of the city and the cities in which Black churches found themselves, of course, in the early 1800s, 1900s, were predominantly white cities. How did the Black church, in your study, how did they relate to the notion of the city?
Yeah. Let me first of all, Larry, you're a good Southerner, right? You're from Memphis and born and raised, and we know about the difficult history of slavery in the South. But I also want to indicate that slavery was also a Northern institution. It was an American institution. And so we need not forget that. So I just want to put that into the hopper, which also speaks to this question of slavery as well as the church, not just being a Southern rural institution, but it was a Northern, it was a Southern, and it was a city institution. And just like much of Christianity grew and developed, as we look at Paul and his travels, he didn't go to rural areas. He went to cities. As he preached his gospel, he went to the byways across Europe and across Asia to bring the gospel to the major cities, Corinth and Rome and Ephesus, etc. And I think that you will see that when African Americans began to embrace the Christian faith, they were embracing them in cities. And as folk began to study the Christian faith and understanding its history, they would go and I'll give you one example. The scholar Rufus Perry. Rufus Perry wrote a book called The Cushites. And he wrote that book in 1888. He wrote this book called The Cushites, and he is tracing out the influences of relationship of black people, of Africa and the Bible. And he goes all the way back into the beginning. And he starts with recognizing Nimrod. We know who Nimrod was. He's the grandson of Noah. And Nimrod was known in the book of Genesis as being the great founder of civilizations, of Babylon, etc. And that's an important component for Rufus Perry, because it points him not only to his Africanness, but also to the connectedness of what it means to be for Christianity to be connected to the city. And the title of the book is The Cushites, or the Descendants of Ham, as found in the sacred scriptures and in the writings of ancient historians, poets from Noah to the Christian era. So African American Christianity has always been centered in cities, as well as in small towns and rural communities and farm communities. But they were also formed in major cities like Charleston, South Carolina. By 1822, the Methodist Episcopal Church was organized by Ed Waters, Pastor Ed Waters, and out of which came the Denmark Vesey Uprising in 1822. There were 4,000 members, mostly free, many free and some enslaved, who were members of that congregation. Now just grab that for a second. 1822. And so that's just one example of the many that we'll talk a little bit about as we go on in our time.
Yeah, so you mentioned Charleston, and there are other cities, major movements, the Black Church, in cities across our country. Could you highlight some of those for our audience, and not only the organization of these churches in cities, but their work in the city?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So let's just start again with another southern city, Savannah, Georgia. You ever been to Savannah, Larry?
I have, yes.
Yeah, Savannah is a beautiful.
We have a leadership foundation there.
Yeah, that's good. That's great. Yeah, it's one of the beautiful cities in the South, and that it is that way because General Sherman, when he was burning his way through the South in the Civil War, saved Savannah from destruction. And he gave it as a trophy, as a present to President Lincoln. And so you go into Savannah, and it feels like you're in the 17th century America, 17th century even New Orleans, with all of the shade trees and all of the stuff that's there. But Savannah also became the seedbed for something else. As we now know, it became the seedbed for the first African Baptist church in Savannah, Georgia. And it was founded in 1777 by a Reverend George Lyle, who was born a slave in Virginia. He was carried by his enslaver into Georgia to continue his enslavement. And somewhere along in that time frame, he was He was converted and around 1773 in the church of his master, Harry Sharp. And then by 1877, he had brought together a group of people in his home, and they began what is now called the African Baptist Congregation. That congregation is still standing.
That's 1777?
1777. And that church sits and stands in the middle of what's called Haitian Square.
Yeah, I've been there.
Yeah, and because there's a monument of Haitian soldiers who helped to fight and defend Americans from the British. Very interesting. And the middle of the Revolutionary War. And that church literally sits right in that square and has been there since 1777. And so you'll find that George Liele, interestingly enough, he decided to serve to not support the American Revolution because he knew that he could gain his freedom if he stuck with the British. And when the British lost, he was shipped out with the British. And let me just say this: it wasn't just George Liele, but 20,000 or more Africans from the south through the north supported the British because the British told them that they could get their freedom if they stayed loyal to King George. And Liele was transported at the end of the war when the British withdrew from Savannah. They left, and he went to Jamaica, and he became the first American missionary to go to another country, i.e., Jamaica. And so even before Judson, right? We think about the Baptist Judson and his great works that he did in in Burma, that he is counted as the first missionary. Not true. It was the African American George Liele that became the first missionary to go to a foreign country, but that's not recorded in history. This church becomes a historic monument in Savannah, Georgia. I'll give you another example. Let's talk about probably one that we might know and be more connected with. That would be the founding of in the city of Philadelphia. When the founding of the country, Philadelphia was the capital city of the country. And there were two churches that were founded roughly around the same time, 1891, 92. One was what we now call Bethel, now AME Church, founded by Richard Allen. And then you have the African Episcopal Church of St. Thomas, which was founded by his partner in ministry, Absalom Jones. These two men were a part of a much larger black community who worshiped in the predominantly white Methodist Church of St. George in the city of Philadelphia. St. George is still there. But the church was segregated. So white people were in the front, black people were in the back. If it got too crowded, black people had to stand along the sides and white people had the seats. White people got the communion first, and then black people came along after. And when they built a balcony in St. George, black people helped to contribute to raise the money for the balcony. And so on the great opening day, they went up into the balcony, assuming they were going to have first seats in the balcony. And as the church filled up, the white people filled up the church, and they wanted to get more white people to sit. And so they tried to move black people out of the balcony. Absalom Jones and Allen, in the middle of a prayer meeting, the white trustees came and said, "You have to get up and move for the white members." And they said, "Let us finish this prayer, and you won't have to be bothered with us ever again." And those two and many of the members of that congregation at St. George left there, and they then began to organize themselves, not first as a church, but they began to organize themselves as what they called an African, the Free African Society. And it became an institution in which they put together sort of an organization that was a fraternal organization that provided folk with supports for the sick, benefits for the widows and the fatherless. It later became a burial society, sort of an insurance company to help folk to bury their dead. And they all paid, they all contributed into the society to help each other as they organized themselves. And then eventually, these two major churches emerged out of this organization, and one was St. Thomas, and the other was Bethel. Now, one last thing I want to say about this, because I think it's important. This is in the middle of the American Revolution. By 1793, the city of Philadelphia experiences a horrific outbreak of yellow fever. And they don't know exactly how it started. It may have been the health conditions of the lack of sewer systems, etc. Some even have argued that it was French refugees from Haiti, at that time San Domingo, who had fled Haiti in the midst of the Haitian Revolution, that came into the city of Philadelphia and brought with them the yellow fever. A city of 50,000 people, over 5,000 people died as a result of yellow fever. And Benjamin Rush, the doctor, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, who was an abolitionist and a great friend of both Absalom Jones and Richard Allen, he appealed to the black community to find people. All of the white leadership in the capital city were running away. Washington went back to Mount Vernon. Hamilton left and went to his ranch, his plantation. All of them were escaping from Philadelphia because of the outbreak that hundreds and hundreds of people died every day. And Rush called upon these black congregations because he seemingly thought that yellow fever wouldn't affect black people. Wrong, but that was how he understood it at the time. And it was the black community who came out and literally saved Philadelphia by nursing and caring for all of the sick people that were ill, and then burying the dead, which nobody wanted to touch those dead bodies. So here you see an example of these two black churches who are moving to not just serve for themselves, but they're serving the whole city of Philadelphia. And Philadelphia would not be what it is today had they not did what they did. Now, it didn't come without controversy. Some accused them of stealing and other stuff, and you find Absalom Jones and Richard Allen writing a long letter taking account of their actions and the actions of their congregations, and trying to defend, the work that they did in saving the city of Philadelphia. Just one, one example.
The same thing happened in Memphis. 100 years later, we had three
Wow.
yellow fever epidemics and those, it was like I often say, it was the Memphis Katrina. Those that could leave left. They freed slaves by that time. This is 1891, from 1898 to 91.
Yeah.
We lost half our population. 50,000 people went down to 25,000. And the folks that stayed behind, of course, were those that couldn't leave, African Americans, and it was the Catholic Church. And the African American Church that continued to care for those that were left behind. Similar circumstance, and they finally figured out it came from the mosquito, right? No one knew.
No one knew. Exactly. Exactly.
This is fascinating. I didn't know that about the yellow fever epidemic way up north in Philadelphia.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
That's 1890s. Yeah.
So this notion of caring for the sick, burying the dead, taking care of the fatherless, the widows, we find that somewhere in Scripture, I think. So the African American experience and the African American church has, from my perspective, and I'm not the historian you are, but have always had a wedding between the gospel proclamation and the gospel of social action.
Yeah.
And so would you speak a little bit to that? What other ways, kind of this antebellum black church, how do they work in both charity and change?
Yeah. This is fascinating because you think about this in multiple ways. Because it was the most independent institution in the black community, they had to figure out ways to educate themselves. And literacy and reading was a double-edged sword, right? And particularly, as you know, particularly in the South, particularly after the Nat Turner Rebellion, 1831, laws were written to prevent black people from getting education, from learning how to read, to abandoning and disrupting schools. In fact, one of the bishops of the AME Church, Daniel Alexander Payne, was from Charleston, South Carolina. He was educated, and he organized schools in Charleston, South Carolina. And once after the Turner Rebellion, it was illegal to educate black folk in South Carolina, and that's what drove him out of South Carolina into the north, into Pennsylvania, which eventually led him to the AME Church. So churches, one of their major tasks was to, while doing Bible studies, we're teaching people how to read. If you can read, then you can liberate yourself, right? And so if you can read, then you learn how to write, then you don't have to put an X by your name on a contract, but you can read the contract and you can know what is happening to you. And so, everything that the church did, from Bible studies to reading of scripture, etc., had a purpose that was more than just building a spirituality. It was also helping to educate and helping people to learn how to free themselves. And I think that we need not underestimate that. They created all kinds of literary societies to be able to read novels and books and the latest scientific discoveries that were going on in the day. And you can, if you do the research, you'll see that many of these churches became kind of one-stop shopping centers within black church communities, particularly in the North. That was less likely to be so, even though there were some, even as some of my Southern historians would like to try to clean up Stonewall Jackson. Stonewall Jackson was a missionary to slaves before he became a general. And even once he became a general, he organized about 4 or 5 black churches in the South that were organized by him from his enslaved peoples who organized churches. And he broke the law and taught them how to read, right? So this is, it's a complicated story, right? So it's not a one-size-fits-all. But you'll find that one of the other things that that churches were at the backbone of was the abolitionist movement and the Underground Railroad. Now, we don't think of those typically as social action, social justice movements, but that's exactly what they were. Because people understood and interpreted the scriptures about liberating those who are oppressed. They took that very seriously as gospel scriptures, as Old Testament and New Testament writings to take seriously. And so you find even the young Frederick Douglass, who was influenced by the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, or one of his counterparts, even more radical, Henry Highland Garnett, who was a black Presbyterian, both of whom's families, both of whom had escaped from Maryland, and both ended up in the North. Frederick Douglass ultimately in Massachusetts, and Henry Highland Garnett in New York City. And these two men would use their influence from the pulpit and from whatever place they could be, and particularly for Garnett, from his small black Presbyterian church in Liberty, New York, in order to become ranking abolitionists. In the 1843 convention of black citizens, mostly clergy, in Buffalo, New York, Henry Highland Garnett gave a speech that he called the Address to the Slaves. And essentially, he argued that the convention needed to endorse his address, which called on slaves themselves to strike the blow for their own liberty. By whatever means necessary. I mean, I'm clear that Malcolm X read Henry Highland Garnett. And by whatever expedience, whatever is most expedient for you. But don't work for these slave masters anymore. Strike. And if the sound of death comes upon you, then so be it. But don't support this institution. And he flowers this whole thing in all of the rhetoric of the gospel, that it is only God that you should obey, and only him should you serve. And the masters are breaking God's will by on and on and on and on. And so you find these men who are involved, and also women. I can't forget the unstoppable Harriet Tubman, who based all of her work, and she worked with churches and Underground Railroad. And this Underground Railroad movement was a multiracial movement. That is, it was both black and white folk who were working together to help black people march with their feet to escape out of slavery from the East Coast all the way into Ohio and into Illinois and to Indiana, any direction that they could find to work their way north. There was this massive Underground Railroad that was both black and white. I sit in Oberlin, Ohio, which was at the seedbed of this movement, and it was both black and white abolitionists who were working to support this Underground Railroad movement. So, again, I think that we could talk more about these various ways, both organized and less organized, that black churches became those centers for both charity, but also for change.
And and we as we move past the Civil War era, post Emancipation Proclamation, how did the Black church continue to implement social change across America?
Yeah, this is, again, I think that education becomes a key component. Many of the first members of the Black members of Congress were ministers. So the churches became organizing tools in the Reconstruction era. You find that many of these northern churches would begin to organize and send their members and educators and pastors to the South to work with these newly freed people who were literally, for the most part, uneducated. Let me just give you some statistics before 1900. It's estimated that the literacy rate among enslaved African Americans in the antebellum U.S. South, that is, the literacy rate was only 5 to 10%. That is, only 5 to 10% of the people who were enslaved in the South could read before the Civil War. The literacy rate among slaves who escaped went up to about 20%. So think about that for a second. If you could read, then you had a better chance of figuring out how to escape and get to freedom. In 1865, the overall literacy rate of the Black community, of the African American community, was roughly 10%. By 1870, and the 1870 census reported that 81% of African Americans in the United States were illiterate, compared to only 8.5% of white Americans that were illiterate. 9.1% of African American children attended schools, compared to more than 50% of white American children who attended schools. 1865. Now by 1900, get this, the illiteracy rate of African Americans fell from 81% in 1870 to 43% by 1900. Now you get that, what's that drop? That's almost a half drop. What explains that? What explains it is the number of Black churches that began to organize themselves throughout the South, many of whom came from northern churches into the South, and some white churches that sent and organized schools. And so you had both the AME Church, the Baptist organizations, the Congregationalists, and others were all sending people into the South to educate and to organize schools. And in fact, one of the characters that I write my book about, Theophilus Gould Stewart, the book Elevating the Race, it's really about he was a northern Black free-born American who in 1865, at 20 years old, followed Daniel Alexander Payne into the South to organize AME churches throughout the South. And as they did that, Alexander Payne knew that he and his people could not educate everybody as well as organize churches. And so he struck deals with these northern white missionary organizations like the American Missionary Association, which were ran by the Congregationalists. Now we would call them the United Church of Christ, to organize schools. So in the South, the church became a school Monday through Friday. On Saturday, it was a social service institution and a recreational institution. And on Sunday, it became a worshiping place. And the pastor on Sunday preached, and on Monday, he and his wife and or some other missionary came in to educate children. And this was the way in which many folk throughout the United States, but particularly in the South, began to educate themselves. And so as a result of that, if you can think of almost any and all historically black colleges, you're going to find that there's a link to a church somewhere. Some are white. Many of them are African American. What's the ones that are in Memphis there?
There's two, Lemoyne, Lemoyne and Owen. One was Baptist, one was Methodist, I believe. And then they merged as Lemoyne Owen.
That's right.
And of course, then there's Russ College in Mississippi.
In Mississippi, that's right.
And there's a college. Where's Payne University?
That's in Augusta.
Yeah.
That's right. That's right. They were a mixture between the Southern Methodist Church and the so-called Colored Methodist Church, now the Christian
CME,
Methodist Church, CME Church. Now all a part of the United Methodist Church, right? But yeah, you could just go through, Morehouse Baptist, Morris Brown, AME, Johnson C. Smith, Presbyterian. I mean, I can just keep going down the list. Xavier University, which was Catholic, right? But they were all being organized to both educate, first with nominal education, and then they rose from primary education into strong liberal arts colleges. All of them. Fisk University. I can just keep going down the list. Tougaloo College. And on and on and on and on. And so the church becomes this major instrument of education that begins to help us to kind of figure out who we are. And then I don't want to forget black women were at the backbone of much of what we think about when we think about the church. They played the more subservient role in terms of the leadership for the most part. But in terms of the educational issues, they were the ones that raised the monies. They were the ones that organized the schools. They were the ones that become the teachers, both in the North as well as in the South. They were the ones that went off in many ways to colleges, to Spelman and to Benedict College and Bennett College and to other institutions, and then became the educators in these schools. You think about people like Mary McLeod Bethune, Bethune-Cookman College in Jacksonville, Florida. It was her work, both first of all, as many of these women could not just work inside the church. They were Christians, and they worked based on their Christian ideals and ideals for social justice, and they worked in secular institutions. And so they organized YWCAs. They organized the National Council of Negro Women. They organized the National Baptist Women's Convention that had more than 1 million women with the founding of the National Baptist Convention in 1897. The next year, these black women organized around the country around issues of education, around health care, around caring for women who were being abused, etc. you have to think broadly when you think about how this church influence is working.
So this, the influence of the African American church on social reform and social justice, social action is it's incredibly rich and diverse. But then what happened in the 20th century? There was a great northern migration of African Americans, and to the great cities of the north: Cleveland, Detroit, Chicago,
That's right.
Philadelphia. What was the role? It was almost like an immigration caravan, if you will, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
And these northern cities weren't prepared. So how did the church respond with southern African Americans that were escaping discrimination and Jim Crow to the northern cities during the Great Northern Migration?
Sure. Yeah. And you'll find all kinds of variations on this theme, right? You will find northern churches and northern pastors who were helping to organize campaigns to bring people out of the South. They're working with the major manufacturers and others in these various cities to recruit black folk into the labor market. You will find people like Bishop Reverdy Ransom, who was eventually became the bishop in the AME Church. Reverdy Ransom in the city of Chicago began to realize that these migrants from the South needed more than just religion, and so he organized what he called the institutional church. That is, they provided not only shelter, not only food, but education, abilities to help them to find employment. They saw as the church as kind of this one-stop shop effort in order to work and help with these massive migrations of black folk who are moving from the South to the North from the beginning of the 1890s and all the way up until just before the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement. I mean, we can just think about another, Austin, James Austin, Pilgrim Baptist Church in Chicago. Again, began to organize ways in which to help support and then to help figure out ways, because many of these Southerners didn't come with sophistication. By the 1890s, many of these northern churches had evolved from the kind of less liturgical churches to more liturgical churches, right? Because they were kind of modeling their white counterparts and becoming more sophisticated and upper class, right? And so not everybody felt comfortable in those arenas. Austin was unique in that he recognized that these Southerners were not going to come and listen to classically arranged hymns. And so he then begins to recruit the blues singer Thomas A. Dorsey, who wrote the great song "Precious Lord, Take My Hand," and on and on and on. Played for Ma Rainey, in the blues circuits. Became a Christian and turned all that blues into gospel music. And he gave Dorsey a place for him to experiment with the development of gospel music, which made those Southerners feel more comfortable being in those arenas. But not all of them felt that comfortable. And so many of them whole congregations would leave a southern city and come and find storefronts in the city. And, we tend to, I grew up in a Pentecostal body, so I speak from what I know. We were known as bench breakers and holy rollers and emotional and shouters and all of that. And we didn't always feel comfortable being in those AME churches and those Episcopal churches and Presbyterian churches because they didn't really know how to worship God, right? Like we did. and so, and they couldn't afford those big cathedrals and the large churches. And so they went and got storefront churches. And they began to worship God in their own way, but also to build community, to help people to be able to navigate these major streets of Peoria, Illinois, and Lansing, Michigan, and East New York, Brooklyn, and on and on and on. And you found those same storefronts in Memphis and in in Birmingham and others. And they tended to be more the Pentecostals and the holiness folk. Now, we write them off. At least some have. But I want to suggest to you that they, too, were doing their part in creating the kind of social space for them to be able to feel like their people could come and find solace and community and to learn how to navigate in these major northern and southern cities.
Yeah, so the history then of the African American church in terms of its interaction not only with the gospel and evangelism, but discipleship and with social justice, social change, spans centuries. But often we concentrate most, because of maybe our age, on the civil rights movement and the civil rights era. But it's important to know that this whole idea of social change and justice was preceded by 400 or 500 years.
Absolutely.
In the African American church. But then we had the civil rights era that, begins to even identify the African American church with social change even more radically.
Yeah.
Could you speak to that a minute?
Sure. Let me go back a bit. Let me go to a theologian, pastor named Howard Thurman.
Mm-hmm.
Howard Thurman was born and raised in racist Jacksonville, Florida. And at a very young age, maybe 15, he ended up with an opportunity to go to Morehouse. Graduated from Morehouse, and then went to Rochester School of Divinity in Rochester, New York, where what's the great social gospeler that came out of Rochester. But anyway, Rauschenbusch, Walter Rauschenbusch. Yeah. And Howard Thurman took his first pastorate, interesting enough, right here in my hometown, Oberlin, Ohio. He pastored a small black Baptist church called Mount Zion Baptist Church, and eventually he gained a national reputation because of his work at Howard University, Rankin Chapel, and then on to Boston University. He started an international church, multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious church in San Francisco, called the Church for All People. But he also took a trip to India in the 1930s, right in the middle of the era of the Gandhi movement. Mm-hmm. And he was challenged there by a Muslim who was saying, what is it that makes you think that you can come to India with your Christianity and bring this Christianity that supported slavery, that your own people were enslaved by, et cetera, and why should we listen to you? And it rocked him to his core. And so Thurman came back and grappled with that. And he wrote this little booklet called Jesus and the Disinherited. And that book became the seedbed for many within the civil rights movements in the 40s and others. In fact, they say Martin and Howard Thurman were dear friends because he was at Boston University at the same time that he was at Boston University doing his graduate work. And you would say that there would be one book that the King would carry with him all the time, and it was Jesus and the Disinherited. And Thurman and his book was trying to understand why did people read the gospel as a passive gospel that would accept the punishment for which, or oppression that was being heaped upon them. And he says that Jesus understood the disinherited, and he argued for them to resist at all costs. And it was that seedbed of that book in part. You also have many black soldiers who had fought in World War II, who are now coming, fighting to free, to rid Germany of Nazism, of fighting to move Nazism out of Italy, fighting in North Africa, fighting in Germany, and being a part of releasing the Jewish camps, concentration camps. And when they came home, they were treated with such disrespect. And that happened after each of the major wars. And these black men and women said, enough is enough. And you begin to see this convergence of people who are now studying the Gospels. They're looking at Gandhi. They're asking these hard questions, and began to come to the conclusion that oppression was incompatible with the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so, and King became the sparker of that. You know, he became the kind of central figure, but he was by no means the only one. Both men and women who came to organize both the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, those who came to organize the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, those who came to organize CORE, the Congress on Racial Equality, those who came and organized the oldest of them, the NAACP, were organized and ran by pastors. And there were some who would say the Sunday worship would end on Sunday at 1 o'clock, and at 2 o'clock the same congregation would hold its NAACP meeting, right? And working to organize around these issues of self-determination and how to rid themselves of these laws and rid themselves of the horrors that they were going through as the Jim Crow was throughout the lay of the land. And so you can think this through in many different ways in which these churches and their communities and the leadership really promoted and pushed the civil rights movement.
Well, A.G., this has been rich. You mentioned a book that you wrote. Would you tell us the title of that book? I'm sure some of our listeners would love to get it.
Sure. It's called Elevating the Race. Theophilus G. Stewart and the Making of a Civil Society.
This has been a wonderful conversation, A.G., and I can't thank you enough for being with us. And I'm sure that if you don't mind, maybe you do mind, if folks want to get a hold of you, would you want to give your email address?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Sure,
absolutely. It's agmiller@me.com.
Thank you so much. It's been a rich time, and I look forward to. We hadn't seen each other for a while. Tell Brenda I said hello.
And same to Becky.
Okay.
All them grown kids are yours.
All right, we're signing off. Thank
All
you,
right.
folks.
Amen.
Well, greetings, Charity to Change participants. We're with two good friends here that you've already heard from, Dr. Terry McGonigal, chaplain of the chapel at Whitworth College up in Spokane, Washington, and with Dr. Albert G. Miller, affectionately known as AG, retired professor of African American Studies, religion at Oberlin University. Both good friends of ours, or all three have known each other for 30, maybe more than that, years. And we're just excited that they're with us today. And of course, you've already heard from each of them on the church in the city and the history of that. And so what we want to do today is just have sort of an open dialogue with Terry and AG about that very topic. And so I've kind of put together some questions, but right before we got on the air, AG just mentioned what he's doing there in the city when it relates to. So, AG, just tell us what you're doing. You got a 4 o'clock call
Yep. Yeah.
with the health department. Is that it?
Yeah, that's correct, Larry.
What in the world is a pastor doing with the health department?
First of all, it's Oberlin College, and I've been at Oberlin 30 years, so you got to reconnect your math, man. We've been much longer than 30 years. So yeah, no, look, as a church leader, even before COVID, I've been a part of in our county, the Lorain County. It's called the Lorain County Pastors Health Coalition, and it's a group of churches, mostly African American, but not exclusively, who have come together to try to organize around health concerns, not only for our various congregations, but also for the larger county. And so we have worked in cooperation with a particular hospital. It's Mercy Hospital, and it's a Catholic hospital. They have a parish nurse outreach program, which is their public outreach component. And we linked up with them, and we organize events, and they come out with their mobile units and do blood drive testings, and so they'll come out and give a whole battery of tests to anybody in the community. I mean, this is up to $2,000 worth of blood and other testing workup, and it costs the participants absolutely nothing. But we feel like that's an important service, to find that information out. As a group, our churches, we organized 3 vaccination clinics in 3 of our major cities in the county, and they were all done at the church as a public service to anybody who were in the community, and people came from all over the region, including Cleveland. Particularly in the spring this year, where vaccinations were hard to come by. And so we just feel like this is doing God's work. And so to have that kind of constant communications with public health officials, with hospital officials, with others, in order to serve our not only our church but our community.
That's a great example of a collaboration of churches. Actually, it would have been probably impossible for you to go alone.
That's right.
It was the collaboration of churches.
No, that's right.
That did that, yes.
Yeah. No, we're a small church, and we feel like we can do better with working together than trying to go it alone and be a lone ranger in some kind of an effort. So, absolutely.
And Terry, when you were in Spokane, you did some, I think, some incredible, very unique work with some refugee churches. Is that correct? With the college?
Well, let me just commend what AG just described. As I mentioned in the presentation that I did, one of the hallmarks of the early church was its deep, abiding concern for the healing of people physically. And of course, the early medical care that has now turned into hospital systems has, came out of the Christian church, especially in the plagues of 160 and between 250 and 270. And even that provide medical care are both come out of the Catholic Church.
That's right.
Sacred Heart and Providence.
That's right.
So, these concerns are at the essence of what it means to be God's people and to be God's church. And of course, in Spokane, we're fairly isolated. It's the largest community between Seattle and Minneapolis. Started world relief work in the early 1990s, just as the Soviet Union was fracturing. And so the first waves of immigrants that came to Spokane were Ukrainians and Russians, and they are now thriving communities, churches, businesses, city and government leaders. But we've had to lean into the changing demographics of the worldwide refugee crisis. And so, I know one of the questions you wanted to address, Larry, was what about moving from charity to development? So real estate prices, both for repurchase of homes as well as rentals, have skyrocketed on the West Coast during this period of COVID. And so a coalition of churches and entrepreneurs have come together to start to purchase multi-unit apartment buildings that are on the market, and then renovating those and making them available for incoming refugees. And right now, between the 1st of October and the end of December, we anticipate that perhaps as many as 300 to 500 Afghanis will arrive in Spokane. And there just aren't that many available empty apartments. So this coalition is going to really lean into not just the purchase of that facility, but it's large. The property is large enough that they plan to double the capacity as quickly as possible. And some of the construction companies that are run by the third generation of these Russians and Ukrainian immigrants, they will be fast tracking the building of more units in order to reach out as an expression of Jesus' love for these people for whom, out of no sense of responsibility of their own, they're victimized of the chaos. And it's up to the church to lean into that. So those are just a few of the things that are happening in Spokane. The reality of one of the things we need to be aware of is the church has always been really nimble and quick to respond as new needs pop up. So here's COVID. Here's refugees. What do we do in our communities? And that really is part of the responsibility of what it means to be sensitive to the leading of God's Spirit.
That's really amazing. So, historically, at least in the last 70 years, but it really started maybe in the early 1900s, there was this divide between the gospel and the social gospel.
Yeah.
Evangelism versus social action. And the church has, sometimes gone one way or the other. It's been hard to keep that balance. Speak to that a minute. How do you keep the balance or tension between a commitment to evangelism and discipleship and the kind of social action that both of you have just expressed?
Larry, that's a very interesting question, because it seems to me that the Black church community has, in some ways, avoided much of that conversation. That's not true for all. I don't want to make a blanket statement. I think the more conservative church organizations have tended to be more in avoidance than the larger body. The church would, its membership would end their worship service at 1 o'clock, and at 4 o'clock they would, the same building, same people would come back along with others to open the discussion, or open a meeting of the NAACP. That is, the Black church has always has seen itself as having to be involved, have its fingers in on the life pulse of what's going on in the community, being the advocate for the community. Again, I don't want to say that that's true for all churches, but I think it's true for many. At one degree or one level or another, they have always had to be socially engaged. And so, you can think about the number of folk, if you look at probably across any of the, just NAACP, I don't know why I'm picking on them, but if you go and look and ask what have been the leadership of any of the local chapters of NAACP, and I'm sure you're going to find clergy persons and other folk who have been actively involved over the years, whether as individuals, but also as churches, the host of the meeting, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that this is, for me, and even some of the more conservative evangelical, quotes, evangelical Black Christians have evolved to becoming more and more in alignment with the notion that the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. And it emphasizes what the Spirit has moved them to do, to preach the gospel, but to give sight to the blind, to give release to the oppressed, and on and on. And so, I mean, I just think that there's a whole new awakening, even in more conservative churches, to recognize that they have to have some skin in the game outside the walls of the church, and that preaching the gospel is more than just bringing people to Christ, but it is preaching good news to their poor conditions, helping them to recognize that they can make a change not only in themselves, but they can make a change in the surroundings and the environment in which they find themselves. And I think that that's a critical distinction.
Well, Larry, I think AG's description is one that reminds us all that the most effective ministry takes place when we don't draw a line between evangelism and service in the community. There was no such line in the early church, and wherever we find churches somehow integrating those various aspects of what it means to live out the gospel, we see effective ministry that includes evangelism. I started my presentation by reminding us all that in the first 6 chapters of the book of Acts, there certainly was evangelism, Peter's Pentecost sermon in Acts 2, but there was also a deep sense of community. They gathered together, they shared food, they prayed, they studied scripture, they met in each other's homes. But there was also this sense of service, so that when the Grecian widows raised their hands in Acts 6 and say, hey, why are they getting more food than we are? They call out the injustice of ethnic privilege. And the church leaned into that, and they changed their leadership structure. So to me, it is deeply regrettable and unfortunate that there's been this binary created falsely between evangelism and social action, which I think is completely unbiblical, but it has really hindered parts of the American church from leaning into this conversation in the way that it should, and and missing out on some great opportunities for effective ministry in their communities. But I think those lines are starting to fragment. I think people are seeing more of the linkage between these various aspects of ministry. I think COVID has forced that.
Given that those lines are being erased, so to speak, or becoming less stringent or strident, then how might, or what are some examples that each of you have seen where churches have really, really been at the center of city or community transformation?
Let me give you an example out of my denomination and church in New York, Brooklyn, New York. It is the House of the Lord Church, located at 415 Atlantic Avenue, downtown Brooklyn. As we say, all roads lead to 415 Atlantic Avenue. And over the years, that church, not only the building, but the people therein, this is a Black Pentecostal church whose leader, the emeritus bishop, Herbert Daughtry, saw that there was no distinction between these two things. And so in the 60s, he was actively involved with Jesse Jackson in Operation Breadbasket, and working to move and then later on with Operation Push, to move businesses to change not only their hiring policies, but the hiring and the ways in which they invested money and the infrastructures and all of that. And he later went on to organize around issues of police brutality. And again, we think of all the modern, George Floyd and on, but in the 1960s and 70s, Black people were dying at the hands of the police. And we ended up doing, and again, trying to push not just for charity, but for change, structural change in the New York City Police Department, to organize a Black United Front that was a socio-political organization that went into the streets in masses to try to change the police department and force it to change, and to all of the businesses that supported that, etc. So and this is all historical fact. In fact, the new Eric Adams, the presumptive mayor of New York City, was an activist in the Black United Front. And Herbert Daughtry and another gentleman, G2 Wayusi, the two of the major leaders of that organization, pulled Eric Adams aside and said, look, Eric, and if you go to the Borough of Manhattan's president's website, he will tell the story. He's very upfront about it. He says, look, these two men pulled me aside and says, Eric, you have potential, but we can't change the police department from the outside. We've got to push it and change it from the inside. And we need to have young Black recruits to go into the police department with the vision to change the police department. And Eric Adams joined the New York City Police Department. He rose up through the ranks, made as many changes as he could, then went into public office, and then became the borough president of Brooklyn, which is the manager for all of what some people say is the fourth largest city in the world, or in the country anyway, with 3.5 million people in Brooklyn alone, and now will be the presumptive mayor of New York City, changing from the inside. And this organization, Herb Daughtry and our church, when the Brooklyn Nets were changing from the New Jersey Nets and were moving to build an arena in downtown Brooklyn, less than 5 blocks from our church, we said we cannot allow that institution, be built in our community, displace everybody without there being community benefits for the larger community.
Right.
And there were several organizations that created. One of them was the Downtown Brooklyn Neighborhood Alliance, the DBNA, and it is based out of our church. And we have worked with them to create opportunities to make agreements with the NETS organization that every event that they have has to allow for local communities members in the Brooklyn community who would never get into the NETS. Certain amount of tickets have to be set aside, and they are given out in a lottery every month. So that if you want to see Billy Joel or Nicki Minaj or whoever, or see the Islanders play in the hockey league, every event has an opportunity for local disenfranchised people to be able to participate. But not only that, they decided that the issues of health are important, and so they have begun to build and linkages with some of the best hospitals in the city of New York to come and to begin to build hospital services, health services for communities. They also began to develop and work on housing issues, and this is all a part of this community benefits agreement that our church and other institutions came together to say, look, you're not going to build and make billions of dollars in our backyard and we not get any benefit from it. And they have structured this. It's a part of the legal agreements. And so, you know, whoever owns the nets and that arena have to participate in those benefits. And so, again, so I think that that's one other real clear example of how a visionary leader came to work with others, community leaders, other church leaders, to begin to say, look, if we're going to have change, we need to do it as a structural change.
Mm-hmm.
You don't want to come in after the fact and say, please give me some charity. We want to say we need to structure in to your building operations of your corporate identity that you're going to serve this community.
Well, and another piece of your story, AG, especially in New York City, is another piece of the change was the whole issue around the unionization of the construction industry. It was run by Italian and Irish Catholics. And it took the kind of coalitions that you just described over time to say, not in our community, not if our people can't get the same jobs that are paying, you know, much better than what they may be making in other places. And so there was a real effort at structural change that continued to benefit in that one particular industry. But that story writ large is what one church can do in its neighborhood when it really is thinking beyond the walls of the church. First Presbyterian Church El Cajon in the heyday of the 60s and the 70s, you know, a 3,000-4,000 member church over time, gradual decline. Now just a couple hundred members, but still sitting on this massive piece of property, big physical plant. And Trader Joe's came to them and said, hey, we want part of your parking lot to put up a Trader Joe's store. And there's a church planter here in Southern California. His name is Corey Marquez. He's planted a church called New Abbey, just about 5 minutes from where I live here in Pasadena. But Corey's expertise is in commercial real estate. And what Corey is trying to do with churches, especially in Southern California, is to say, do not sell your property. It's a one-time cash windfall, but what are you going to do with that money? Rather, figure out how your property can become an ongoing source of revenue. And so what Corey did was he negotiated with Trader Joe's on behalf of this church a lease. I think it's a long lease, like maybe 50 years. And so part of the profit of every sale of that store that's on the leased land in the parking lot of this church is now funding ministry for that church. And because of where they're placed geographically, they've been able to develop over time a very significant first stop respite center for immigrants that are crossing the border at the Tijuana-San Ysidro exchange there, which has more people crossing it than any other particular border in the entire world every day. Again, keeping our eyes out for what the needs are in our particular communities, what the opportunities are, and then saying, what can we as the church do to leverage the network of our relationships for the common good?
No doubt. The pastors and lay people, you've got, pastors leading, lay people hopefully leading as well. But I suspect as churches move into this sort of transformative activity in their city and community that may not look traditionally like their church outside the walls, I suspect some pastors will get some pushback, and some will say, well, wait a minute, isn't the church, aren't we just supposed to spread the gospel, make disciples? Why should we get involved in social justice at all? How would you engage pastors with that question? Because it's no doubt going to come up from time to time.
Sure. Well, let me just do a lead off to that really provocative question, Larry. In March 2020, Andy Crouch, who used to be the editor of Christianity Today, wrote this short little article that has been very influential in terms of our work with churches. And the name of the article is Leading Beyond the Blizzard. And this was, just in the first few weeks of COVID. And he said, some people are going to think about this COVID thing like a blizzard. Blows through, dumps some snow, the plows come out, warms up, melts off, and the trouble goes away in a few days or maybe a week. Some people are going to think of this as like a winter season. Okay, all we got to do is hunker down from November to March and survive the cold, and then we're going to be okay. And he said, I think this is going to be like a mini ice age. And in every ice age, the glacier moves over the land, and it's slow and it's imperceptible movement. But once that glacier passes over, the land is changed forever. And I think we are in one of those mini ice age moments. The church is being called to look and function differently because culture and society have changed so much, so incredibly quickly. So, there's no going back to the way it used to be. We can't go back. We have to look forward. And that's always been another hallmark of the church, is the most innovative ministry pops up in the most creative and unsuspected ways. And the opportunities that are here, AG, your illustration of what happened in Brooklyn is a great illustration of that. A whole community transformed because a basketball team decides we want to play in Brooklyn. Nobody mapped that out. Opportunity arose and the church responded. So I think this is a moment for the church to be resilient in thinking about what are the opportunities before us now that look very different than the way they were pre-COVID.
Well, I wholeheartedly agree. I think the word that keeps coming to me in my mind is pivot. I think based on all of what Terry has laid out for us in terms of what the time is that we're living in, are going to force people to make some hard decisions.
Yeah.
This is, and you're right, it's more of a glacier model, that what we are experiencing right now, we will never go back to an old normal.
No.
We have to now think through how we create a new normal that helps us to rethink what does it mean to be a community of people, that the church is not a building. The church is the people of God, And if we do not understand the great commandment to love God with all of our heart, mind, and strength, and to love our neighbor as ourself, we will be in grave trouble. And I think that church leadership has to kind of rethink. We're going through a little rethinking process now, as our church has been online for almost 18 months. And we're now trying to figure out if we can get back into the building. But what will that look like? It is not the building that has kept us surviving. It is the people of God. And how do we now use a building to help move us into the community to serve in ways that we may not have been able to do so before?
Right.
And so these are I think new challenges that we're all facing. And if we stick our heads in the ground or play like we're Rip Van Winkle and go to sleep, we will have slept ourselves through a revolution. And when he went to sleep, it was King George that was king. When he woke up, there was a new George, a president of a new United States. And I think that we have to be, Dr. King talked about staying awake in the midst of revolution.
Yeah.
Not to fall asleep, but that the church itself has an obligation and a responsibility to be at the forefront of what's going on and the changes that we're going through in this country and across the world, right? And so I think that that kind of theology, it will see if it stands the test of time. And I'll say it there. We'll see. But be willing to go back and to always reassess where you are based on where you've been and what you see coming in front of you. Because we're seeing a very changed world. And if we're not willing to pivot, that doesn't say you change your theology, but you have to rethink how you implement that theology in the world.
Well, and let me just add, part of what I see are the stakes in this. AG, you and I have lived in the collegiate world for decades. All the Barna research talks about younger and younger generations becoming disenchanted with the church. And in my experience, it's not a disenchantment with the church. They want to see the church leaning into the very issues that we've talked about on the call for the last hour.
That's right.
So when they hear that Jesus is passionate about whatever the particular topic is, in a city, a town, a neighborhood, and that people of faith are in the middle of engaging those particular needs, it's like, well, if that's what Jesus is like, I'm all in.
Right.
That's the Jesus I want to follow. So to come full circle, Larry, to where the conversation started, in an ironic kind of way, evangelism is at stake with the younger generation. But it's an evangelism that's going to depend upon their seeing community engagement from the church.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, we're seeing the whole millennial generation and the next generation totally disenchanted with the church as normal, as it used to be.
Right.
And they're wanting to see the gospel in action in their cities and communities.
2014, we began this new work at Whitworth University called Church Engagement. And, we didn't know COVID was on the horizon, in 6 years. But it was basically raising the kinds of questions that we've talked about. And that this whole track, Charity to Change, is getting churches to think about. I see this as an incredible opportunity for you to be resilient in terms of facing honestly and realistically all the challenges of this moment, but then at the same time, to really take as a matter of prayer and a matter of networking in your communities, what is it that God would have your particular church to be and to do? And how is it that you can participate in the development of shalom for the city? What do we want those cities to look like? And how can we as churches be a part of what God is doing in your communities?
Gary, you mentioned shalom for the cities. And an immediate image popped in my mind of when Jesus went and looked over the city and he wept. I want you to be able to look over the city and weep. That is, ask God to move you to the point that you can't stand still, but you have to go and do something. I want you to take a concept out of the great Catholic tradition. The priest would look in a city and he would see his cathedral or his building, but that was not his ministry. His ministry was the parish. That is the neighborhood, the community that surrounded that building. And he saw himself as the priest of the parish. And I think that we need to begin to see ourselves as the priests of our parishes, the priests of our cities, and be willing to be brokenhearted for the city, for the community in which you reside, and not just for the membership that you serve. Because I think that we need that kind of passion and compassion that is going to move us to break out of our building boundaries, but to become citizens and evangelists for the world. And so I'm hopeful that by going through this process that you're going through now is going to spark and spur you, challenge you, push you, make you rethink, make you pivot, make you become wherefore if anyone is in Christ, they're what? New creatures. The old has passed away, and behold, all things have become new. Look for the newness and allow God to move your hearts to become the citizens of his kingdom that he's looking for, as they say, in these last and evil days, as my own church tradition would say. But we need people who are going to be able to pivot and to change and to be willing to reassess themselves in order to be able to do the ministry that God is calling them to.
Well, this has been a rich conversation. Thank both of you, Dr. McGonigal, Dr. Miller, for being with us. And with that, let me just close in prayer. And God, thank you for these two men and their ministry with us. But help us to weep over our city and to seek its shalom. Break our hearts for what break yours. And be with us through your Holy Spirit to move us to this new reality and to love our cities and our communities well. In Christ's name, amen. Thank you both.